expensive and time-consuming thing. And the best people at building a brand should be you, yourself, and I. So we participate in that brand building of ourselves, creating more value in our brand before we approach a distributor or a wholesaler. It makes that relationship go smoother if we were to ever sign with one, because we have a following and we have accounts, we have business established in that area already. Other types of alcohol manufacturers in the state of Michigan. We've got small distillers, we've got distillers, we've got winemakers, small winemakers, and probably the one brewer's license that confuses everybody is called a brew pub license. Now, this would be, I'm trying to think, but probably the best example of this would be like Hopcat or Grand Rapids Brewing Company in downtown Grand Rapids. They operate under a brew pub license, which is a manufacturing license that gets paired with a Class C liquor license. So they can actually serve other people's beers as well as their own. They can serve hard liquor, wine and beer by the can or by the bottle. And the limitation to that brew pub license is they cannot distribute ever. So they get some advantage by being able to bring in other alcoholic products beyond just what they make, but they're not able to distribute their product at all beyond that. So that's kind of, I think, a quick rundown there. I'm just going to kind of pause at the end of each slide, and if anybody's got any questions on what we just covered, feel free to speak up, and I can tackle those as we go. So Railtown's history, like I said, we got founded in 2014. We started with 3 employees. It was me and my partner Jim, and then my brother-in-law Josh, who is our current head brewer. We've seen all phases of growth. We've moved from completely operational hands-on to completely strategic hands-off in about 8 years' time. So we got going in about 2014, brewed our fingers off to get ready for grand opening, had our soft opening Black Friday 2014, and pretty much ran out of beer in 2 weeks. So what we had anticipated was just going to be kind of a weekend gig, turned into a full-time gig right at the beginning of 2015. 2015 was very much a awareness year for us, getting our name out there, getting a reputation built. Brewed about 220 barrels of beer in 2015. A barrel of beer is 31 gallons. Most people recognize beer by the keg, so a full-size keg is half of a barrel. So each barrel is 2 of those. So basically brewed about 440 half barrels of beer that first year, and we've grown ever since. By the time we got into 2016, we were having a difficult time keeping up with demand. So we started off in a strip mall space of about 2,400 square feet, and we ended up leasing the 3rd suite next to us and knocking down the wall and expanding our seating, almost doubling it. Went from 48 seats to about 85 seats, and that proved very worthwhile. That was a great expansion, and demand continued to build. Eventually, we had the opportunity in 2017 to purchase land directly adjacent to the strip mall space. There was actually a self-service car wash there that we ended up demolishing and building our current facility that we're in today. So we went from 2,400 square feet in 2014 to about 8,250 square feet with a full restaurant in 2018. And this year in 2022, we are on pace to brew about 700 barrels of beer. Moved from 3 employees 8 years ago to about 43 today. That's a number that changes on a weekly basis at this point. Unfortunately, it's just kind of the sign of the times. But we've seen tremendous growth in our team size. And then I just wanted to provide a little bit of context for what is a barrel of beer, how big is Railtown, how does it compare? So I tried to pick some that were most applicable. Founders Brewing Company here in Grand Rapids is probably, it is the biggest brewery here in Grand Rapids, one of the largest in the state. They brew about 500,000 barrels of beer a year. So they're about 100 times bigger than we are. And then, so Founders tanks, their biggest tanks are 1,500 barrel tanks. So every 2 weeks, they're filling those with beer and draining the beer out of those. So basically, if we brewed for 2 years, we could fill 1 tank that they're swapping every 2 weeks. And then on the other extreme side, you have Budweiser. Budweiser brewed about 488 million barrels of beer just last year. So we are considerably smaller than Budweiser, and would have to brew about 700,000 years at our current pace to brew what Budweiser brews in 1 year. So fun with numbers. Craft beer during Railtown's history. So we opened up, like I said, in 2014. It was kind of the middle of what I would call the expansion era of craft beer. If you go back to the 1980s, there were about 80 breweries that were open in the nation, 80. By the late 2000s, we were looking at about 1,500. By the time we opened in 2014, there was about 4,500, and there's about 9,000 today. So if you graph that out and kind of looked at that chart, we're very much kind of in the middle of that upswing. Consolidation era, this is something that occurs with most markets, right? Anything that sees a tremendous amount of growth is bound to consolidate at some point. There's been various reasons for the consolidation within craft beer. A lot of it has been bigger beer eating up smaller beer to remain relevant in local communities. The first big deal I think that happened was the Goose Island purchase by Anheuser-Busch. I think that was 2015 or 2016. A lot of the M&A, merger and acquisition activity really picked up in 2017 and 2018. Like I said, there's a lot of regional breweries. Regional breweries is kind of a phrase for breweries that are in like 8 to 10 states or so. They're buying up a lot of smaller breweries because the regional brewery growth was slowing. So they decided to add growth by buying some of the smaller brands that were experiencing significant growth. And then you had big beer, Anheuser-Busch, your Diageo's, Constellation brands, some of your big alcohol outfits started to buy some pretty big regional breweries. And that was their way of getting their feet into the craft beer market, because at that point, most liquor was losing quite a bit of market share to craft beer. Craft beer was a very fast growing segment, and they wanted a part of that. So in 10 years time, we've gone from craft beer kind of being a niche thing to being pretty much prevalent. I remember going to bars and restaurants before we got going, and you'd ask for what was on tap, and folks would tell you, they'd give you the rundown of the domestic beers that they had on tap. And you had to be very specific. No, what craft beer do you have on tap? And now you go into bars and restaurants, and everybody expects there to be 10, 20, 30 taps. Craft options are very, very prevalent. You're no longer the weird guy at the party for drinking craft beer. Most people are doing it. So it's been quite a change over the last 8 to 10 years. And the prevalency of craft beer across most markets in most states is really quite a story in and of itself. Beer style wise, figured I'd cover this a little bit. So back in the 80s, anything that was craft pretty much had to be imported. You're getting a lot of stuff from Europe, and that was pretty much anything other than a light lager. And we got into the 90s, and there was growth in craft, and you had a lot of folks that were brewing very basic beers, stouts, porters, pale ales. And by the time we got to the 2000s, everybody had kind of done the basic styles. So everything started to get really extreme. Everybody's going for high alcohol, high IBU. IBU stands for International Bittering Unit. That's kind of a rough gauge for how bitter a beer could be. So they were going for the most bitter beer that they could. Barrel aging came into the market. There was a 2-year period where it was black everything. There was a new malt that came out that wasn't as bitter as most other dark malts were. So you saw black lagers, and you saw black pale ales and IPAs and black wheats. Everything was black there for about 2 years. And then more recently, you're seeing it with white stouts or white Russian stouts. It's basically a golden colored beer that has all of the characteristics of coffee. It's that roasty, bitter, nutty type of approach, but it kind of messes with your mind because it's not the color that your mind would expect it to be. And the same was the case with the black beers early on. Went from extreme to hazy everything really. 2017, 2018, everything became hazy. And that's proven to be a great movement for craft beer. There's a lot of growth that came out of that. Hazy beers kind of started over in New England. There was a couple of breweries that started those late 90s, early 2000s. And the movement has kind of moved pretty much across the world at this point. I don't think there's too much else to say there other than M43 was probably the most popular Michigan beer outside of Two Hearted on tap there for a couple of years. But there's a ton of folks making really excellent hazy beers now. Seltzer entered the market, and seltzer is kind of an interesting one. So seltzer is classified as beer by the federal government. So when seltzer picked up, it was a good opportunity for craft breweries that maybe were not experiencing a ton of growth or wanted to expose themselves to an additional market or a new market. They were able to make seltzer under their current licensing and taxation. So that became a very trend-worthy item, 2018, 2019. Boston Beer Company with Truly Hard Seltzer was really the one that pushed that, along with White Claw by Mark Anthony. COVID came in and kind of messed everything up. So I'm not going to talk too much about COVID. I think everybody's sick of hearing about COVID, but I will talk about some of the impacts and the trends that have occurred because of COVID. So probably the biggest thing that came out of COVID was everything went into cans. Being forced to shut down and not do service on site, we as an industry had to figure out a way to continue to get our product in customers' hands. So before, if you looked at store shelves, it was majority of bottles on the shelf. And since COVID, it's shifted to a majority of cans on the shelf. And a lot of that has happened because bottling lines are much more expensive and not as cost effective as some of the canning operations. So a lot of small breweries got their own canning lines and started putting their product into cans because they really had nowhere else to put it. Couple that with the massive increase in seltzer sales, which was all canned stuff. We'll get into RTD or ready to drink cocktails. That market's exploded. That's all in cans. There was a huge demand that can manufacturers were not expecting. Nobody could really expect it with COVID, but the market is still kind of reeling from that, and it's still difficult in some areas to get our hands on aluminum cans. So that was a huge shift for the market. And now if you look at store shelves, it's primarily cans on the shelves. I think it's probably about 90% of cans instead of bottles. You're starting to see some breweries shift back to bottles because they can't get cans. So it's supply and demand at work there, and you're starting to kind of see shifts because of it. Distribution saw a huge shift during COVID because bars and restaurants were closed, right? So as a manufacturer, we had to do something with our product. So we either packaged it to go to sell out of our facilities, or we packaged it up to put on store shelves. So while bar and restaurant sales plummeted, takeout sales or off-premise sales at liquor stores went through the roof. So with that, there were a lot of breweries that were not distributing to the state of Michigan that started to distribute in the state of Michigan because they had excess production. So rather than sit on it or reduce their capacity, reduce their production, they decided to sign on distribution with additional states, including the state of Michigan. And there were some huge brands, some very popular brands that came into our market during COVID that are still prevalent today. Toppling Goliath, Three Floyds, can run down Untitled Art. There's a good number of them that came into our market during COVID because they had excess production. But that resulted in a huge shakeup at bars and restaurants. So they're 2 years, into things. There's no longer a running assumption that you're going to be on tap because you're a local brewer. There's so much more competitiveness on the taps at this point than there were even 3 years ago. It really kind of shook things up there. The other big thing that came out of COVID was sober curiosity, or sober curious, or trying to think of the other phrase for it, but the non-alcoholic push. So this was something that was kind of starting before COVID, actually, on the East Coast and the West Coast. There's a lot of bars in LA and New York that are mocktail bars. So basically it's a cocktail without the alcohol. It was only a matter of time before this hit beer, and now it is one of the fastest growing segments in beer is non-alcoholic beer. Non-alcoholic beer is a very different product to make. We do not make it here at Railtown because of that. We focus on our bread and butter, which is still the alcoholic beer, but that's a big market to keep an eye on. It's made a ton of progress. There's actually some very good tasting non-alcoholic beer. Beer styles have started to go back to the basics. So we kind of went from basics to extreme to hazy everything, and now we're kind of going back to basics. And a lot of that is because of the innovation with raw materials. We, as an industry, craft beer wasn't that prevalent. We had a difficulty getting custom equipment for a lot of the 1990s and the early 2000s. But by the time there's 1,500, 4,500, 9,000 breweries across the country, a lot more business folks realize that there's a market for providing equipment to this vertical. So craft beer equipment market exploded through the 90s and 2000s. A lot of what we lack technologically or innovation wise is now being produced in mass. So innovation really shifted away from equipment to raw materials. So now we're starting to see some very, very cool changes in yeast. There's new cultivations in hops. There's new malting technology. Basically, it's allowing us to create all kinds of new flavor profiles with the same basic raw materials that we had been using before, with completely different outcomes. So that's kind of spiced up and made basic styles really interesting again, because you've got so many new options to apply there. Seltzer starts to fade. I mean, as quick as seltzer came into the market, to me, I guess it just kind of reminds me a little bit of Zima back 20 years ago. As quick as seltzer came in, it seems like seltzer's going back out. The numbers there are just, it's incredible how far and how fast seltzer fell. And a lot of that had to do with RTD, or ready to drink cocktails. So this could be anything classified as like basically anything involving hard alcohol. So high noons are vodka-based seltzers, so that would be considered an RTD. You've got those pre-mixed Bloody Marys, you've got the mules, all that stuff. That market is absolutely exploding. And that's caught the attention of a lot of other market segments on a global scale. So you're starting to see a lot of the hard alcohol players start to be interested in kind of these crossover drinks, if you will, to appeal to this new market. And with that, the non-alcoholic beer has also caught the attention of non-alcoholic business. So you're starting to see PepsiCo and Keurig Dr. Pepper, Monster Beverage. They're starting to take interest in some of these alcoholic productions, and utilizing their distribution channels for that. So that's kind of remains to be seen where that's going to fall. But this really is the first time in beer history where you're starting to see some real crossover with non-alcoholic companies having interest in alcohol companies. So we'll see where that shakes out on a regulation side. But we're still confident on the craft beer side of things. We feel like we still have the advantage in the alcohol market because our time to market with products is considerably shorter than it is for most other alcoholic products. For us, it's about 2 months or so by the time we get our raw materials in to when we produce the beer to a finished product that we can tap and sell. You start dealing with hard liquors that are barrel aged, or wine that goes in barrels. Obviously, there's some quicker ways to do some of that stuff, but in terms of innovation and being able to respond to a market, craft beer definitely has the advantage because we are more nimble, and we get more nimble every day with those advances in innovation with raw materials like yeast. So that is kind of the quick synopsis of craft beer's history in the last 10 years. Beyond that, I didn't have too much other commentary to make. Just kind of wanted to open it up to questions. I know there's a lot of the beer industry that I didn't cover. If there's anything on anyone's mind, I'm happy to answer questions.
Sure. So we got our first question. What's the most popular beer at Railtown?
So we have 3 mainstay beers. We've got a Bike Ride Blonde, we've got Good Mood Milk Stout, and we've got a Shady Side IPA. Basically, our rule in the market is have something light, have something dark, and have something bitter. And you pretty much cover all your bases with that. So it's either our IPA or our blonde ale, somewhat seasonal, but those two are always neck and neck for our top sellers.
Cool. Looks like next question. What's the easiest beer to produce, and is it also the most profitable?
Ooh, that's a good question. There are certain beers that are easier to produce, technically speaking. Like an IPA is a good example of that. Hops cover up a lot of potential flaws in a beer. So if you didn't execute perfectly on a beer, you can really kind of cover it up with hops. Not that we try to do that, not that we do that. But as professionals, we always kind of judge a brewery based on their lightest beer. So if I walk into your place and have a light lager and it's clean and it's crisp and it tastes exactly like it should, I know you've got pretty good brewing chops because there's absolutely nothing to hide behind there. IPAs are probably our most profitable beers. They're not quite the cheapest to make, but they are so far ahead of any other style category in terms of sales. It's really the bulk of, I'd say pretty much up to 45% of our sales is in IPAs.
Awesome. Thank you. All right, we've got a few more questions here that just came in. What was a huge challenge for your business and how did you manage it?
So I grew up in a small business family. So I kind of had some insight onto what it would take to run a small business and be successful. I saw what it takes to wear all kinds of different hats. But yeah, I still think I underestimated how much I didn't know. And getting into a completely new market, I had no history in craft beer whatsoever. That was a big challenge. Just learning the ins and outs of it. There's still a lot of it that I don't know on the distribution side of things. But the one really cool part about the brewing industry is it's so collaborative. We're all friends across town, across the country. If I walk into a brewery down in Tennessee and tell them I've got a brewery up in Michigan, it's like we're, high school friends, and we raise a beer together. We talk business. We learn from each other, because as I mentioned with the size context, we are so much smaller than Anheuser-Busch. It's really us against them in terms of the market. So just figuring out everything that I didn't know.
We have heard before that the brewing community, you guys are a tight-knit group.
For sure.
Lisa asked, how does your production compare to other local breweries like Harmony, Mitten, and Brew Vivant?
So I haven't seen last year's numbers for Grand Rapids area, but I think we're like top 8. You've got Brew Vivant is bigger than us. We're bigger than Harmony. New Holland is bigger. Perrin is bigger. Founders is bigger. We've pretty much grown to be, I think the 6th largest here in Grand Rapids. So Mitten Brewing has a substantial operation. They've got a full production facility. Our production facility is tied right to our restaurant. So we definitely have more space than some of the smaller outfits like a Thorn Apple Brewing or trying to think, City Built does quite a bit of distribution. So their footprint's a little bit smaller on site, but we're pretty, I think, equivalent in size to City Built.
Very cool. Joey wants to know, what's the biggest challenge in moving from corporate world to starting your own business?
I think it kind of ends up being a silly thing on the other side. I think it was all the fears of what life would be like, what the challenges would be. Most of them ended up not being that scary. I mean, self-insuring and paying our own taxes and filing, all those roadblocks that you put in your way to go into business for yourself, and all those concerns that are in the back of your head, really were the least of my worries at that point. It's the scariest part was starting from the ground up on something and jumping ship as quick as we did, without a ton of revenues coming in, without profitability. That was definitely the scariest thing. But there was so much that I worried about before we got going with business that I look back now and I wish I had done it sooner.
Well, a little bit in that same vein, the last question we've got here is, what types of funding did you use for startup and expansions?
So the so startup, we did cash out of pocket. It was something that I had hoped to do for a number of years before we got going in 2014. So I stuck away my pennies there for a few years. We started with cash out of pocket in 2014. We were one of the smallest outfits in the state of Michigan at that point. Our brewing system was tiny when we got going. Like I said, this was anticipated to be kind of a weekend thing. So it kind of took off from there. So I think you'd be hard pressed to find a brewery that started on a smaller budget than we did in 2014 in all of Michigan. From there, the first expansion was pretty much 50-50 with capital on the books and bank funding. And then the new build is financed through a local credit union.
Wonderful. Well, I've gotten through all of the questions, and I just wanted to thank you, Justin. We really appreciate it. So check out our website on our alumni page to register for our upcoming events. Thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful holiday season, and thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Justin.
Thank you, guys. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Justin. This was awesome.
Awesome. Good to hear, Lisa. Thanks for attending.
And I have been to Railtown too.
Appreciate the support.